Well, let us get down to brass tacks. I'd like to invite folks who are here to the third of 4 joint virtual and live talks offered as part of the DH lecture series this year in partnership with the Think Lab at Guelph, some of whom you can see off to the side here, and our partners in Montreal at CRIN, the Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur les Humanités Numériques. Today's lecture is taking place on unceded Algonquin territory, and we pay respect to the Indigenous people of this region and from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa their home, and acknowledge their leaders here on this land, past, present, and future, recognizing, of course, that territorial acknowledgements are not enough and are not an endpoint in themselves, and not the only way to address historical and ongoing violence against the people on whose land we are gathered. It's a real pleasure for me today to introduce Cecily Raynor. Professor Raynor joins us from Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the Department at the University of McGill, where she is also a member of the Center for Digital Humanities. Her scholarship focuses on contemporary Latin American and Brazilian literatures, as well as the digital humanities. Her current book project addresses the evolution of national and transnational literatures through the representations of space and time. In the digital realm, Professor Raynor examines the blogosphere as a post-national space with special attention on the development of digital cultures and community. Her talk today is entitled Decolonizing the Digital Cultures of Connectivity in the Latin American Web. So, join me in thanking you. Thank you for coming.
Does everyone hear me okay over there? Yeah, okay, perfect. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking CRIN, and in particular Michael Sinatra, as well as the Humanities Data Lab here at the University of Ottawa, and especially Connie Crompton, as well as the Think Lab at Guelph and DH at the University of Ottawa for the generous invitation to speak with you today. It is a pleasure to be here and discuss some of my work at the intersection of Latin American studies and digital humanities.
I apologize. Into that.
So just down, okay, perfect. Today I'd like to think through 2 primary questions as we explore some of these intersections. Firstly, how has increased internet participation in Latin America changed how its citizens engage with and create cultural content? And secondly, what modes of analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, can we employ to enter this dynamic territory? More broadly, I'd like us to consider some of the methods we use as digital humanists to engage with Latin American digital life and various modes of decolonizing our field, in particular web practices, to make it more inclusive, multilingual, and non-hierarchical. I'd like to mention that a lot of what I'll be talking about today is actually coming from a second book project called Digital Encounters in Contemporary Latin American Cultural Production, which is under contract at the University of Toronto Press and will come out in 2021 in their spring collection. I've been co-editing this with Rianne Lewis. Before turning to those questions, I'd like to begin by exploring the web in Latin America broadly. From Tim Berners-Lee's implementation of the World Wide Web in 1991, Latin America has not remained insular from the online space, but rather has a correspondingly well-developed cyberculture and cyber literature. In Latin America, everyday life hinges upon an unprecedented connectivity. As HILDA CHACÓN affirms in her study of Latin American online activism, quote, "We are without a doubt witnessing the greatest paradigm shift that humanity has ever observed in the field of communications and global interconnectedness." This connectivity manifests as social media plugins, Wi-Fi enabled public spaces, artificial intelligence, an entire ecosystem of connected devices in the Internet of Things, along with backgrounding of surveillance technology and the datification of human activity. I'd like to take a moment quickly to discuss these 2 images that you see before you. Here we see a new take on an image from Joaquín Torres Garcia, which was originally published in 1943. Torres Garcia attempted to upend traditional hierarchies of North and South and consider Latin America in its own terms, a signal of independence from the hegemonic importance of global cities such as New York or Buenos Aires. New York or Paris. Perhaps the digital space might serve as a new arena for questioning hierarchies and cultural territories and communities. As a thematic point of departure, connectivity allows us to address diverse concerns at the intersection of technology and Latin American cultural production. For example, the term connectivity often denotes the level of internet access in a region. Yet diverse lines of inquiry emerge when the initial premise of connectivity is reimagined as a productive space of creation and conflict. At the material level, we can ask questions about the role of hardware and physical infrastructure in inflecting practical limitations as much as creative processes. Thus, a slow connection can be read both as a matter of inequitable access and stratified rhythms of networked engagement, as well as a disruptive aesthetic inspiration through glitches, failure, and digital malfunction. Similarly, the association of connectivity with access begs further questions about the role of intention and desire in configuring the outcomes of networked activity. What do users want from their interactions with digital technology? To whom do they wish to speak? And what do they want to create? From these encounters, we can further interrogate the impact of digital technologies on systems of knowledge and power. Ways of knowing and speaking are made visible or rendered obsolete in this space. What heterogeneities are revealed in this encounter? How is the fabric of social interaction, or even the interpretation of analog or print cultural objects, altered through contact with the digital? Thus, the issue of connectivity must be considered beyond the ability to connect to the internet to encompass the context, output, and affective dynamics of these connections. A connection might link a user to other people, to motives or snippets of code, to activist movements or community-generated literature. To grasp connectivity, we must understand the digital space as a hubbub of voices and actions that collide along the lines of identity, experience, and desire. In the second half of the 1990s, Latin America witnessed a dramatic surge in internet connections from 500,000 to 9 million users by 1999, according to Corrales in 2002. This boom continued through the first years of the new millennium, a tidal shift in internet access that accompanied substantial changes in regional modes of interaction with digital technologies. When they published Latin American cyberculture and cyber literature in 2007, Claire Taylor and Thea Pittman noted that the dominant mode of internet access in Latin America was through educational centers or community-based telecentros. Although the increase in internet penetration has accompanied a rise in broadband connections, Latin Americans' internet use has also become fervently mobile in recent years. I wanted to take just a quick moment to discuss this slide, which actually is from a graffiti artist in Brazil, primarily based in Sao Paulo. His name is Crânio. And he takes indigenous subjects, the Tupi Guarani, of course, being the largest indigenous populations in Brazil, and really kind of looks at their interaction with digital devices, in particular cell phones. And he creates an entire ecosystem of this sort of digital iconography, this intersection between the indigenous subject and the digital world. Here you see one who's using their laptop, et cetera. And really he also kind of looks at some of the downfalls and pitfalls of the arrival of late capitalist neoliberalism to Latin America. If you look at the graffiti where you have the indigenous subjects standing in front of the Brazilian flag, what you'll see is it says sold. So this idea that Latin America has often been sold out to some of the kind of politics of neoliberalism. And normally this would say order and progress inside the Brazilian flag, just to give you an idea of some of the popular culture that has kind of accompanied these larger changes around the web. So as a result, scholarship on digital connectivity in the region's cultural production reveals two distinct modes of connection. One that offers the privacy and ultra portability of a 3G and beyond enabled device, and the other a more stationary internet characterized by communal use and semi-public space. Turning to the present, network connections have become faster, and mobile technology has increasingly become the primary means through which Latin Americans access the internet. Yet, As communications theorist Alexander Halavais has argued, economic and political dynamics are encoded into the architecture of digital spaces. Despite the burgeoning population of internet users in Latin America, the corporations that own much of the digital infrastructure of the region are often US or European based. Of the top 10 most visited sites in Latin America, half are owned by companies based in the United States or Europe. As digital conglomerates like Alphabet hone their ability to calculate the forms of knowledge that users can access, not to mention the kind of data that they create in doing so, it becomes clear that the internet, what Carlos Monsiváis calls the, quote, symbol and practice of globalization, has wide-reaching post-colonial articulations. As such, crucial changes in the fabric and prominence of digital technologies have necessitated a new reflection on the Latin American digital encounter. Each of these configurations of human digital connectivity implies a specific set of limitations, cost differentials, and relational and creative capacities. In this way, connectivity is a precursor for social and cultural practices of borrowing, remixing, and sharing. I'll talk about borrowing, remixing, sharing, remediating later on in the talk. In my research, I investigate a world where digital and analog spheres are increasingly entangled, generating ever intimate interactions with code, new forms of communication between authors and readers, and activist movements that depend on the narrative capacities of social media. As such, I explore a diverse set of case studies with which to ruminate upon connectivity that characterizes Latin American online cultural production. Among them, digital literature, online activism, glitch and media art, transnational short films, and programming languages. And understanding the Latin Americanness of digital cultural production, one can turn to Claire Taylor and Thea Pittman's 2013 study, and then in turn Scott Weintraub, in their interpretation of Latin American cultural production as that which originates from a specific cultural, linguistic, and geographical cartography that is marked and transected by the Latin American in a particular way. In our examination of the Latin American web space, it is important that we ascribe cultural parameters to digital cultural production on the periphery. This means dismantling and placing into question traditional markers of success, developed largely in the technoscapes of the global north, including measuring internet access by speed, quality, and content. In areas of the world where engagement with digital technologies is often heterogeneous, creative, and dynamic, we need to rethink how we approach the muddy cultural landscapes of the digital encounter and enter into modes of reimagining what the construction of digital selves might look like outside of the global north. As a digital humanist, I engage a variety of tools in my research and teaching practices in order to bring digital dialogues related to the global south to life. I wanted to talk just briefly about some of those here. Obviously, there's a number of tools that we're all using in DH. Some of the ones that we use in my particular research and teaching are Gephi, of course, Tableau, Voyant, which of course was created by Jeffrey Rockwell and my colleague Stefan Sinclair at McGill. Within text mining, I also use Voyant, but then also a tool called QDA Miner. And I also look at sentiment analysis in large scale bodies of text. And then in particular, something that I'm particularly engaged with is web analytics, using Google Analytics, SimilarWeb, and Alexa. I started out my research platform with Alexa and then have recently found SimilarWeb in the last couple of years. And then these are both sort of out-of-the-box tools that you can use without having subscriptions, where you can look into the traffic of a website without necessarily owning it. In contrast, Google Analytics is a site, of course, that requires ownership in order to be able to fully understand and kind of really engage with the full capacities of that tool. Geospatial tools, including ArcGIS, Google Earth, and with KMZ files, of course. I had a student who recently won a Fulbright scholarship to go to Brazil to study the communities in the Amazon region that were connecting with different types of ecological processes. And she used Google Earth to really illuminate some of these communities in ways that I think were pretty interesting. And then, of course, web-based CMS tools, CMS, of course, being content management systems, are pretty popular for housing large projects, really large and small projects, and I've used a number of those with students. And then in recent years, in the last 2 or 3 years at McGill, I've been at McGill for 5 years, social media analysis has become increasingly popular amongst my student population. We've been using a system called tags. I'm not sure if any of you have used it before, but what it does is it really automates the collection of Twitter data across time. So it allows you to set something up very easily, and then you can collect tweets across years, months, years, weeks, whatever your interest is. And then if you have more of a deeper foothold into programming, of course, using the Twitter API, using particularly R. And then one of my students has used Node.xl, which uses JavaScript to also collect social media data. So these are some of the things that we're using, that I'm using in my own teaching practice and research. Wanted to actually just take a moment to talk a little bit about how I'm using web analytics to illuminate these digital spaces in Latin America. So in my case, these tools can be used to better understand transnational readerships, as in my own research on how trans-Hispanic communities read literary and cultural content on the web. This slide shows visual representation of audience geographies using data from Alexa Web Analytics. So we can note here the strong Argentine concentration of audiences for La Nación, which is an Argentine paper. I should mention just quickly, I wish I could step over here, but I'm kind of limited to being over here. So La Nación is one of the largest newspapers in Argentina. La Tercera is one of the largest newspapers in Chile. And El Boomerang is a transnational site that's actually based out of Spain. Its IP address is in Madrid, but then it's run out of Barcelona. It's actually funded by El País, which is the largest newspaper in the trans-Hispanic world, and it's located in Spain. So I wanted to give an idea of what this particular visualization is looking at. So we can note that the strong Argentine concentration of audiences for La Nación and the more dilute concentration in Chile for La Tercera. However, both sites are significantly more bounded by nation in terms of readership than the deliberately transnational literary blog El Boomerang, which is provided here for comparison. So I wanted to give you an idea of how I put these tools to life. They've also been used in my students' research of social media dialogues, including this visualization of 3,000 tweets in the Guatemalan hashtag campaign that led to the removal of Otto Perez Molina and other senior officials in 2015. Here, my student Josh Berman visualized these tweets thematically to understand some of the major issues that arose in the Twitter dataset using Node.xl, a network analysis and visualization software. Similarly, my student Rianne Lewis used Gephi to visualize the conversations that were emerging in the Twitter sphere around a hashtag project called Mi Primer Acoso, or My First Harassment in English, which is a Latin American hashtag campaign that began in April of 2016 and continues to this day. This network graph was generated from all of the tweets from a corpus of 19,000 that mentioned or retweeted another user. Among those tweets that did not include quantifiable connections to other users as mentions or retweets, there was an understandable dominance of news coverage from media outlets and commentary by public figures. So some of the, you see these little kind of volcanoes that are emerging in this data set. Those are essentially news outlets such as BBC Mundo. So what my student actually is really arguing here is that we need to talk about the conversations that are happening outside of these larger news conglomerates and look at individual narratives, look at the ways in which people are describing their sort of own lives and their own instances of sexual violence, rather than necessarily relying upon larger data sets and ways of quantifying that and visualizing that, looking down to both the small stories and then the larger stories that are emerging. So notably absent from this view are the model tweets, really the ones that look at my first harassment, Mi Primer Acoso, where mentions of other users are virtually non-existent. So we see less than 1% of some of these individual stories in this larger visualization. Highlighted by this visualization and reiterated also in my research practice is the importance of local lives on the global internet. I wanted to mention that my first book, my monograph, finally, after 7 years, is coming out also in 2021, and it looks at the tension between locality and globality in contemporary Latin American literature. It'll be out with Bucknell Press in the spring also of 2021. So I'm really quite interested in how do we capture local stories within these global kind of phenomenon. So we need to listen to local stories through large-scale data analysis in tandem with close reading cultural content and digging into the intimate connections that exist in local ways. Indeed, despite the notion of the web as a homogeneous space, a transnational domain, there are communities that have emerged based on the notion of shared languages, identities, and experiences, as well as localized digital practices. One can look, for example, to the recent presidential election of Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was elected largely based on massive WhatsApp communities emerging in shared chats. The web has always been and always will be shaped by sociocultural norms, an experiential platform that highlights cultural diversity and similarity in powerful ways. Thus, in contrast with the supposed globality of the web, users engage this space in very local ways. At the level of search, of community building, dichotomies between cyber-utopian, hyper-egalitarian ideals, and the highly specific and inequitable local practices. In Eduardo Arriaga Arongo's work, he's examined this as looked at this, how this serves to disrupt the notion of a flat, utopic realm in which Latin America is situated. So kind of adding some texture to the idea of the web as a space that is flat, right? A space that's equal, a space that's sort of cyber-utopic. Given the importance of social media activism in Latin America, it is essential to consider how to read and understand the connective tissue of storytelling, a space in which narratives and political action collide. Beyond the analysis of networks mentioned in previous visualizations, there are overlapping narratives that speak to political action, which must be approached in a multimodal fashion through network analysis as well as social and close narrative analysis. At the same time, the sensitivity of some of these stories raises ethical questions. Digital projects are part of global knowledge, but who owns them and who has the right to tell these stories and how? Regional focused movements such as Mi Primera Coso or Renuncia Ya, which Resign Now, which I mentioned earlier, as well as Vivas Nos Queremos, which is We Want Ourselves Alive, another feminist hashtag project to speak to the femicides that were happening across Latin America, the death of many women, remind us of the role of situated knowledge in digital cultural production, as theorized also by Donna Haraway in the late 90s. In the complicated terrain of the web, we need to put place and identities back into a seemingly stateless transnational cybersphere. This also happens as global hashtag movements emerge, including Me Too. This example bears mentioning as it highlights the dominance of Anglophone social media in defining origins of social movements online. Not only was Me Too not the first hashtag to prompt women to openly identify and create solidarity around the ubiquity of sexual violence, but earlier hashtag campaigns, including but not limited to Mi Primera Coso, have long been doing the labor of telling these stories in Spanish and other languages and in territories that originate in the global South. Thus, we need to see beyond our immediate digital conversations, which often happen in English or are translated to us immediately into English. We can think of how Facebook does this, of course, when we have another language that we're looking at, they say translate, and we can translate that right now. So translation is happening often without our consent. What happens when we want to return to these original language groups and think about these things in other territories and in other geographical linguistic landscapes? We need to acknowledge the margins, the peripheries, and the non-cores as a vital part of these dialogues. Despite its sense of urgency and apparent atemporality, the web content has a historiography, and placing some of the rich moments of the web history into their diverse geographical homes is crucial. The Latin American web reminds us of the importance of access to information and the ownership of data. Questioning the scope of impact on online representations and problematizing our understanding of intellectual property and influence. Again, we need only turn to Brazil here to reflect on some of these issues, a country in which the free and open source software movement, or FOSS, and issues of net neutrality lie at the heart of debates on digital citizenship in the region. I wanted to mention that prior to Bolsonaro, there was another political party in power in Brazil called the PT, the Partido dos Trabalhadores, or the Workers' Party. And many of you might recall Dilma and Lula being part of that. They were both actually really quite involved in the free and open source software movement, and then propagated relationships with companies like Firefox and others that were doing work to kind of bring greater access to technologies in the region. So Brazil has been a leader in both areas of, again, for free and open source software and net neutrality, and is the first country in the world to create a civil rights framework for the internet. Actually, I'll show you. This is actually from Brazil. It says Marco Civil da Internet, which means the civil rights framework in Brazil. This was an open platform for Brazil's citizenry to collectively decide how they wanted their internet to look. While this legislation had major limitations, which I'm happy to speak about in the question and answer portion, its very existence is important when we think about the intersection of digital and political culture in Latin America, a region in which cyber realities, ideals, standards, and truths diverge across terrains. So I wanted to mention this. So what this really was it was a moment in time when Brazilians were allowed to go online and discuss openly in an open platform how they wanted their internet rights to be. Again, I'll talk about this later in the question and answer if anybody's interested in knowing more, but really I think it kind of sets a precedence for thinking about how to collectively conceive of a public internet and what that means also in terms of digital citizenship, national citizenship, and where those two things collide. So this has been a really essential part of Latin America, not only in Brazil, but also Mexico, Chile, Argentina, thinking about internet rights as both national rights and then also global rights, I think is really important here. So indeed, Latin America frequently disrupts the notion of access and the web as a flat process. What we observe through digital cultural production in the region is that there are multiple user experiences of the web across platforms, infrastructure, and time. The role of language plays a particularly important part of decolonizing our approach to the Latin American web, as observed in the need for taking a critical approach to typeset text. This also means being open to critiques of our own tools, to incorporating oral traditions into our work, both online and offline. As Tim Berners-Lee, of course, reminds us, he says, the web does not just connect machines, it connects people. It is essential to revitalize indigenous languages with over 900 spoken in Latin America alone, and to work to combat language erasure and provide a sense of community for isolated projects and speakers. Janet Chavez Santiago, one of the keynote speakers at DH 2018 in Mexico City, for those of you who were able to attend or perhaps saw a recording of this, speaks of this, of course, in her work. This was the first DH conference to be held in the Global South, and what Chavez did was create an online oral dictionary for the Zapotecan language. And she reminds us of the importance of creating spaces for peripheral language communities. She says, digital media can be seen as a warp on which the speakers of indigenous languages have an opportunity to weave their word and to share it with their own community and beyond. Although in our times of digital media and social networks, are a practical part of our daily lives and our interactions with the world, we as speakers of indigenous languages must truly appropriate these spaces to weave our word well, in order to liberate ourselves from a denial of the present. Even within far less peripheral language communities such as Spanish or Portuguese, which are really world languages, much work needs to be done to move outside of the Anglophone dominance of the web. In my research, I strive to understand trans-Hispanic and trans-Lusophone, so looking at Spanish and Portuguese, relationships and why little overlap between them seems to exist. As this slide, based on 6 months of web analytic data reveals, Spanish-speaking newspapers seem to rank fairly well across trans-Hispanic language territories, with Brazil almost in obsolescence. So just take a minute to explain this slide. So La Nación, again, going back to the Argentine paper, and Mercurio is from Chile, Folio de São Paulo is from Brazil, and then El Boomerang is this transnational literary content site. So what we're seeing is that Brazil only seems to rank in terms of ranking as a website in Brazil, whereas the other newspapers are kind of revealing a trans-Hispanic community, with the exception of Argentina, of course, ranking as almost 4,000 in Brazil. I think that also speaks to issues of borders between Argentina and Brazil, Brazilians living in Argentina, and also the reverse. But this is a curious thing, this very interesting linguistic divide between Spanish and Portuguese. So as this slide shows us, Spanish-speaking newspapers seem to rank fairly well across the trans-Hispanic language territories, with Brazil an obsolescence. Folio de São Paulo, one of the leading news sources in Brazil, only ranks in Brazil, and La Nación, an Argentine paper, is the only Spanish language news source of the ones I studied to rank at all in Brazil. This linguistic divide is telling and food for thought as we piece apart the two major language communities of Latin America. The Portuguese-Spanish divide continues to be a nearly impenetrable barrier in the digital space where readers and content producers collide. I'm happy to speak to some general thoughts about that as well in the question and answer if anybody has any questions on that. I happen to be a Brazilianist who works largely on the Southern Cone. I was hired as a Brazilianist, but then I also do a lot of work within the Spanish language communities. Our largest conference is called the Latin American Studies Association, where it's around 4,000 participants. And imagine just hundreds upon hundreds of panels, and maybe about 5% on Brazil or in Portuguese. So really there seems to be a big disconnect here between these two language groups, something that we're seeing in the online space as well. So this also means being open to critiques of our own tools, which I've already discussed. So one important mode of decolonization of DH is in our establishment of structures, forms, and institutions in cultural production. This means pushing for web analytic data in non-proprietary, marginal, and peripheral users, artists, and cultural producers on the margins. This work defies conventions of form. This is also related to publishing and thinking outside of the big Anglophone publishing paradigm in Spanish and Portuguese, not allowing some of the typical scriptures of publishing to be replicated online. I should mention that another issue that we're seeing in Latin America is sort of monolithic publishing happening across both Brazil and then Hispanophone Latin America. So we have a few singular publishers that are really overtaking the market. There's been a number of challenges to the entrance of digital devices and e-readers into this market because of these large publishing conglomerates that have become sort of a machine or institution. So how might the online space serve as other realms for the publishing of peripheral, marginal, or even non-canonical works? These are some of the questions that I look at. The big one in Brazil, the big publisher in Brazil being Companhia das Letras. Yeah, so I can talk about that also in the question and answer. So open source and accessibility and all of their nuances matter. At the level of code and knowledge sharing, content that extends beyond the commercialized proprietary web, a tension that we've seen since its inception. In the cyber utopia of folks like John Perry Barlow, and the cyber pessimism of the web as a commercial space, and also a realm for propagating agendas and disinformation. Latin America can also teach us a number of lessons with regard to remixing, sharing, and culture hacking, and bending the notion of intellectual and cultural property. One need only turn to examples such as techno brega, a musical genre in the Amazonian region of Brazil, in which sampled pop music, often defying copyright, is mixed with traditional beats of brega, a musical tradition seeped in the history of North and Northeastern Brazil. In order to produce a hybrid hacked genre that reigns both online and offline spaces. Here we can see the use of digital iconography and how it dominates in this dynamic, ever-shifting, and vibrant take on traditional sounds. In this way, Latin America can provide us with many lessons on the creative, local ways in which technology and culture collide, often relying not upon major advancements in speed or progressions in software or hardware, but on molding, mixing, melding, and then taking existing forms and digital offerings and turning them into something new. I should also mention that this is often done under conditions of minimal computing, as we've seen in the case of Cuba and Venezuela, which have been explored at length by folks like Alex Gil at Columbia and Elik Ortega at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And what we're seeing is the production of multifaceted cultural products and practices. So why don't you just take a moment also to stop on this slide. So really what we're seeing is the use of popular beats from popular music that's really taken from across the North American and South American genre, and then mixed without asking for permission, for sure, in many cases, with very traditional Brazilian music. And then what we're also seeing is the movement of these large large musical production platforms called aparellagings, or basically like drums and various the actual the hardware of this that are move across and around Brazil. And so what we can see here also is that the figure at the top photo actually has a piece of internet iconography written on his chest. Can anybody tell me what that looks like? I feel like I'm teaching here, but it looks like a chip, exactly. So really what we're seeing here is the use of this iconography to enter into this, this kind of a realm of culture hacking. Okay, so in our engagement with DH, we need to question authority and technological hegemony, looking beyond favored models, structures, and institutions, and towards alternative ways of qualitatively and quantitatively exploring regions that lie beyond the global north. This means looking at gaps in data sets and who is not being represented, as well as what data does not lend itself well to our current analytical structures. Twitter narratives were our case study from earlier today. We need to move beyond IP addresses and consider the ways in which communities exist beyond and in harmony with their technical homes. We need to question whose labor we are using, whose data we are analyzing, and whether we have the ethical permission to push forward into projects that might give a semblance of anonymity because they existed in open ways in the past. How we recount narratives of sexual violence, for example, or anywhere for that, in Latin America or anywhere for that matter, is a good example of this. Just because someone may have posted something in something personal on an open Twitter account 5 years ago does not mean that we can harvest their Twitter data and corresponding username without their consent. One day after International Women's Day seems the right moment in which to remind us of this in our ongoing attempt to keep the humanist in DH. As we explore the intersection of Latin American cultural production and digital connectivity, we grapple with the messy, ever-shifting territories of virtual spaces and tools. As CHACÓN writes, the internet, quote, has given us a different sense of our own temporality by subjecting us to continuous, nonstop rewriting, restating, and redoing, and self-transforming by interacting with other mediums whose compelling content may very well disappear overnight, end quote. As digital humanists, we must look at both the construction and deconstruction of these projects with content that can shift from vibrant and active to ruinous or even absent within a microsecond. We must embrace these discussions of conflict and contingency, investigating the power dynamics and ethical questions at play here. Together, we must contemplate how Latin America and the world engages the digitally mediated connectivity of contemporary life. Thank you so much.